Here's something that might surprise you and maybe even frustrate you. Many candidates with great English struggle with CELPIP reading part 2, not because they don't understand the text, but because high-scoring candidates approach this part in a completely different way. They don't try to read everything. They don't get confused by the visual layout, and they definitely don't waste time reading the diagram from top to bottom. Strategic preparation makes all the difference. This is the approach candidates use inside our CELPIP packages. When they focus on strategic preparation rather than simply studying harder, their scores can transform dramatically. In this video, you'll learn how high-scoring candidates think, what they do differently during the test, and how you can start using the same approach. I'll give you 10 powerful tips that can transform how you handle CELPIP reading part 2. If you're tired of running out of time or getting the same score again and again, keep watching. This might be exactly what you need. CELPIP reading part 2 is called Reading to Apply a Diagram, and it's quite different from the other parts of the reading test. Instead of reading a long article, you're working with a diagram. For example, this could be something like a schedule, a flyer, or a guide to a community activity, like applying for an ID card or registering for a course. This section has 2 parts. First, you'll answer 5 questions about the diagram and a short email connected to it. Then you'll answer 3 more multiple choice questions, also based on the diagram and email. What makes part 2 challenging is that you're not just reading for the sake of understanding. You're reading to apply information. You need to figure out how the details in the diagram relate to a specific person's situation as described in the email. Now, let's get into 10 specific strategies that can help you score high in part 2. Tip number 1 is to preview both the diagram and the email before you start answering questions. This might feel like it's wasting time, but it actually saves you time in the long run. When you first look at the diagram, ask yourself a few quick questions. What kind of visual is this? Who created it and what is its purpose? Also, check how the information is organized. For example, are there sections, categories, or a timeline? This quick scan helps you understand the layout. This gives you an advantage because when you go looking for specific information, you already have a mental map of where things are. Next, take a look at the email. Identify who wrote it, who it's addressed to, and what the writer's purpose is. This is important because the email gives you a scenario. Usually, it's about a specific person with a specific need. Your job is to apply the information from the diagram to that person's situation. For example, the diagram might be a city recreation center brochure. The email might be from someone asking a friend which swimming class to register for. If you take a look at both in advance, you'll know exactly what to look for. Without this step, many candidates waste time searching the diagram without direction. The second tip is to tackle each question individually using a focused, targeted approach. Don't try to hold multiple questions in your head at once. Here's how it works. Read the first question carefully and pick out the keywords. Keywords are the words that will guide you to the right section of the diagram. Look for specific names, numbers, times, locations, or categories that are unlikely to be paraphrased in the diagram. This helps you find the information fast. For example, take a look at this question. According to the brochure, the early bird registration discount applies to. Here, the keyword is early bird registration discount because it's a specific term from the diagram. Scan the diagram for that term, read the relevant section carefully, and then choose your answer. After you've answered the first question, move to the next one and repeat the same process. This keeps you focused and prevents the layout of the diagram from overwhelming you. By the way, if you want this channel to keep going, write yes in the comments, click like and subscribe. We only make videos that you actually want to watch. Tip number 3 is to understand that the diagram and the email work together. You often need information from both to answer a question correctly. This is one of the most important things to understand about part 2. The email introduces a person and their situation. The diagram provides the detailed information. Many of the questions will ask you to combine both pieces of information to find the answer. For example, the email might describe a woman named Priya who works Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Priya is looking for a beginner fitness class. The brochure might list several classes with different schedules and experience levels. A question might ask which class Priya should register for. To answer it correctly, you need to check the schedule from the brochure against the constraints described in the email. Priya doesn't have time on Tuesday and Thursday evenings because she works during those times. Candidates who only look at the diagram or only look at the email will often choose the wrong answer because the correct answer requires you to connect the two pieces of information. Always ask yourself, how does this detail from the diagram apply to the person in the email? Here comes a tip that makes a big difference. Don't try to read the diagram the way you would read a paragraph. Diagrams in part 2 are designed to be scanned, not read from beginning to end. A diagram is organized visually. It might have columns, rows, sections with headings, icons, or separate boxes of information. When you go looking for an answer, use the structure of the diagram to guide you. If there's a heading that says pricing or eligibility requirements, go directly to that section when a question is about cost or who can register. This is much faster than reading line by line from the top. Many candidates lose time in part 2 simply because they treat the diagram like a reading passage. If you scan, you can find the answers much faster. Let's move on to tip number 5. Train yourself to recognize paraphrasing. The questions in part 2 will rarely use the exact same wording that appears in the diagram or the email. For example, the brochure might say, registration closes 7 days prior to the session start date. The question might ask about the deadline to sign up. The meaning is the same, but the words are different. The problem is this. If you're scanning for the phrase deadline to sign up, you won't find it, so you might think the information is missing. However, the information is actually there. It is just expressed differently. Common paraphrasing techniques in part 2 include replacing specific words with synonyms, changing the sentence structure while keeping the same meaning, and using more general language to describe specific details. For instance, the diagram might say, participants must provide proof of residency. However, the question might say, attendees need to show documentation confirming where they live. Recognizing paraphrasing is a skill you can improve with practice. Every time you review a part 2 question, check whether the correct answer uses different words from the diagram, and notice how the meaning is the same. This helps you recognize paraphrasing over time. Tip number 6 is to pay close attention to conditions and restrictions in the diagram. These are specific rules. For example, who can participate, what is required, and what limitations apply. Diagrams in part 2 often include this type of information, and the questions will frequently test whether you've understood it correctly. For instance, conditions might look like this. Available to residents only, or discount applies to first-time participants only. These details are easy to overlook when you're scanning quickly, but they're often exactly what the questions will ask about. For example, a question might describe a specific person and ask whether they qualify for a particular program. The correct answer often depends on one small condition buried in the diagram, like an age restriction, a membership requirement, or a deadline. A great way to find conditions in the diagram is to pay attention to specific words like only, must, except, or unless. These are signals that a condition or restriction is being stated, and that information is very likely to appear in a question. Tip number 7 is essential. Use the email to find the answers. In other words, let the email guide your search through the diagram. The email gives you a specific scenario, and that scenario tells you which parts of the diagram are actually relevant to the questions. Think of it this way. If the email describes someone who is looking for a weekend yoga class for beginners with a budget of under $50, you don't need to read every single class description in the brochure. You can immediately focus your attention on weekend classes, beginner level, and the pricing section. Everything else is background information that you don't need to spend time on. This approach is particularly useful when the diagram has a lot of information and you're feeling the time pressure. Before you dive into the diagram, take a quick look at the email and remind yourself of the key details about the person and their situation. Then use those details to narrow down where you're looking. High-scoring candidates don't read the entire diagram. They use the email as a filter to identify the sections that matter, and then they go directly to those sections. Now, let's talk about tip number 8, which is about inference questions. Many CELPIP candidates find these questions challenging. Inference questions are questions that don't have a direct answer sitting in the text. You have to use the information provided to draw a logical conclusion. Here is an example. Based on the brochure, Stefan will most likely need to. The tone of the email suggests that the writer is, for this type of question, the correct answer is never a wild guess. It's always a logical step based on what the texts actually say. Start by identifying the relevant section of the diagram or email. Read it carefully and then ask yourself this question. Given this information, what is the most reasonable conclusion? A common mistake is to choose an answer that sounds reasonable based on general knowledge or personal experience, rather than what the texts actually support. Always go back to the text. If you can't point to a specific detail that supports your answer, it's probably not the right choice. Here comes tip number 9, which is about the second set of questions in part 2. After the first 5 questions, you have to answer 3 more multiple choice questions. These questions ask about both the diagram and the email. They are usually slightly more challenging because they often require a closer reading of the details or a bit more inference. Here is a warning. Don't assume that you remember everything you have already read. Go back and check. It's very easy to think you remember a specific detail and then choose the wrong answer. Don't rely on your memory, but on the actual text. These questions follow the same 3 types you'll see throughout the reading test: general meaning, specific information, and inference. If a question asks about the overall purpose of the diagram or the general message of the email, think about the big picture. If it asked for a specific detail, scan back to the relevant section and confirm the answer. And if it's an inference question, make sure your answer is supported by something actually stated in the text, not just something that seems reasonable. If you are unsure about an answer, use the process of elimination. If you can rule out 2 options that clearly don't match the text, you've already improved your chances significantly. Finally, tip number 10 is about time management. You have 9 minutes to answer 8 questions in part 2. That works out to just over 1 minute per question, which means you need to stay focused and keep moving. If you get stuck on a question, don't keep staring at it. This wastes a lot of time. Use the process of elimination to remove answers that clearly don't match the text. Then make your best choice from what's left and keep going. Remember, there's no penalty for wrong answers, so you should never leave a question blank. Don't forget to keep an eye on the timer throughout part 2, so you make sure that you have enough time to answer all questions. Those are 10 essential tips for scoring high in CELPIP reading. Part 2. If you're serious about achieving the CELPIP score you need, check out our CELPIP packages using the link below. We'll guide you step by step on how to score high, so you'll feel confident on test day. I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you're notified when the next video comes out. Also, share this video with your friends so they can improve their CELPIP score too. See you in the next video!